I used to laugh at ghost stories. I always figured they were exaggerations, tales passed around to scare children or keep thrill seekers entertained. That changed on a bitterly cold night in November, when I saw something I still can't explain. It was just past midnight, and I had stayed late at a friend's flat in Chelsea. The streets were nearly empty as I made my way to South Kensington Station, hoping to catch one of the last trains home. The air had that damp chill that seeps into your bones, and the quietness of the station made everything feel off. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something unsettling right away. The entire platform was deserted. No late-night travelers, no security, not even the hum of a distant conversation. Just me and the endless stretch of dimly lit tiles. The silence felt wrong. I checked the departure board. The next train wasn't due for another 8 minutes. I sighed, stuffing my hands into my coat pockets and pacing the length of the platform. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint, indistinct, like the hushed breath of someone speaking just out of earshot. I froze, straining to listen, but there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Probably just the pipes shifting or some trick of the station's acoustics. That's what I told myself. Then the air changed. A sudden coldness crept up my spine, sharp and unnatural, like stepping into a freezer. The hairs on my arms stood up. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see movement in my peripheral vision. A woman. She stood near the far end of the platform, barely 6 feet away. She was dressed in a long black gown, the fabric hanging like wet shadows against her pale, almost translucent skin. Her hair was dark, framing a face that was both hollow and frozen in time. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were sunken, empty, like twin voids that swallowed all light. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words stuck in my throat. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming at me to run. Then she moved. Not like a person should. It was more like a flicker, a stutter in reality. One moment she was at the edge of the platform, the next, she was closer, too close. My breath hitched. My skin turned to ice. I could feel her staring, feel the weight of something unnatural pressing into my chest. The whispering began again, this time louder, curling around my ears like a snake. And then the lights flickered. For a split second, everything plunged into darkness. When the bulbs flickered back to life, she was gone, but the cold remained. A second later, the distant sound of an approaching train filled the tunnel, shaking me from my trance. The platform was still empty, no sign of her. I staggered backward, my breath ragged, my legs weak. As the train screeched to a stop, the door slid open, revealing a mostly empty carriage. Without thinking, I rushed inside, desperate to get away. The moment I sat down, I caught my reflection in the opposite window, and that's when I saw her again, standing right behind me. The train doors hissed shut, the whispering never stopped, and neither did the cold. New York City subway stations always have a certain energy, a mixture of chaos and routine, of rushing footsteps and muffled announcements. I've lived here long enough to become numb to it, to the strange sights and stranger people. But that night at the 50th Street station was different. That night, I saw something I still can't explain. I was waiting for the downtown train, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I noticed a man pacing near the edge of the platform. He was muttering to himself, his movements jerky and erratic. At first, I assumed he was just another guy having a bad night, maybe homeless, maybe high. But there was something off about him. His clothes were soaking wet, not like he had walked through the rain, but drenched, as if he had just crawled out of the Hudson River. Water dripped from his sleeves, pooling onto the grimy tiles. His head twitched, his mouth moving in silent, frantic words. And then he stopped. He lifted his head, staring straight at me from across the platform. His eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with something I can only describe as pure terror. I swallowed hard and looked away. Whatever his deal was, it wasn't my problem. I was just waiting for my train, just another commuter trying to get home. Then it happened. 1 second, he was standing there, his breath coming out in sharp, panicked gasps. The next, his body went rigid, like something had grabbed him from behind. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then he fell. Or, at least, he should have. People around me screamed. I stepped forward, expecting to hear the sickening crunch of his body hitting the tracks. But there was nothing. No impact. No movement. Just empty space. I blinked. The tracks were empty. I rushed to the edge, looking down. Maybe he had rolled under the platform. Maybe. But there was no one there. The train's headlights pierced the tunnel, casting long shadows across the rails. If he had fallen, there should have been some sign of him. A shoe. A crumpled body. Something. But the tracks were untouched. Clean. As if he had never been there at all. People were gasping, looking around, asking if anyone had seen what had just happened. A man near me swore up and down that the guy had been yanked back, like something had pulled him into the dark. The train arrived seconds later, screeching to a halt. A transit officer ran over, trying to calm everyone down. Witnesses kept repeating the same thing. He was there. And then he wasn't. When the police arrived, they shut the platform down, checked the tunnels, reviewed security footage, and that's when it got worse. The camera caught everything. It showed the man, pacing, whispering, his wet clothes clinging to his body. It showed him locking eyes with me. It showed him falling forward. But the instant he should have hit the tracks, he disappeared. No impact, no motion blur. Just gone. Like he had been swallowed by the darkness. The police never found a body. No missing person matched his description. It was as if he had never existed. But every time I take the subway now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still there. That somewhere in the dark, beneath the platform, he's still falling. Still whispering. And maybe, just maybe, he's not alone. I had been in Beijing for 3 months when it happened. The subway had become part of my daily routine, efficient, packed, and impersonal. I had learned to keep my head down, earphones in, and avoid eye contact with the strangers pressed too close beside me. That night was no different. It was late, just past midnight, and I was taking the last train home on line 2. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting the familiar dull glow over the nearly empty car. I had scored a seat near the window, something that rarely happened during the rush hours. I barely noticed when the train began to slow down. The announcement system crackled, but instead of the automated voice calling out the next stop, there was only static. I frowned, pulling out one earbud. Outside, the tunnel lights blurred past, but something was wrong. I had taken this route every night for weeks. I knew every station, every advertisement on the platform walls. But as the train lurched to a halt, I realized this was a station I had never seen before. The signs were old. The characters faded, as if they had been left to decay for decades. Cracks slithered across the tiled walls, and the platform was coated in a thin layer of dust. No posters, no signs of life, just emptiness. Then, the doors slid open. An icy breath of air swept through the car. I turned to the few remaining passengers. Most were staring at their phones, pretending nothing was wrong. But the man across from me, an older gentleman in a dark coat, was gripping the pole so tightly his knuckles turned white. I followed his gaze to the windows. And that's when I saw them. Shadowy figures, shifting just beyond the glass. They weren't moving like normal people. They seemed to glide, their forms flickering like candlelight. No faces, no features, just dark, elongated shapes pressed against the windows, as if watching us. My breath caught in my throat. Then, one of them moved closer. It stopped inches from the window, its head tilting, as if it knew I was looking at it. The train remained still. The doors gaped open like a silent invitation. The static from the speakers grew louder, warping into something that almost sounded like whispers. "Come out." I shot up from my seat. The old man shook his head sharply, his eyes wide with warning. "Don't move," he whispered. His voice was barely audible over the static, but the fear in his eyes said everything. The shadows outside twitched. Then, one of them reached for the door. A shape stretched, pressing against the invisible barrier of the train's entrance. The air turned frigid, thick with something I could only describe as wrong. Then, the doors slammed shut. The train lurched forward. The moment the platform disappeared into darkness, the static cut off. The lights flickered back to their usual harsh brightness. The passengers stirred, suddenly aware of their surroundings again, as if nothing had happened. I turned to the old man. He was gone. A few stops later, I stumbled onto the platform, gasping for air. The next day, I scoured the internet, trying to find out what station we'd stopped at, but there was no record of it. just rumors. Stories of an abandoned stop, one that had been shut down decades ago after an entire train disappeared into the tunnel and never came out. The conductor later swore that we never stopped, that there was no station in that part of the route. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see the shadows, still waiting.